Well, good evening. My name is Derek Pope, and I convene the Church and Society Committee of Hamilton Presbytery. And so, on behalf of the Presbytery, may I welcome you to this public lecture and conversation this evening. There can surely be no more important theme than health and wellness, and no greater aspiration that these are available not only to some, but in fact to all. And so our theme this evening is of deep and of universal significance. But I know too that it's not only our theme which has brought you here this evening, it is also the reputation of our speaker, Professor Harry Burns, who is Professor of Global Public Health at the University of Strathclyde. Harry Burns has been thinking and writing and teaching on the theme of health and wellness for, I don't know, maybe 30 years. But his interest in them is not primarily academic. He is absolutely passionate about those things because he's passionate about human flourishing and the fullness of life for all. And so we are absolutely delighted that Harry has come here to Motherwell this evening to speak and to answer questions and to lead our conversation on the theme of health and wellness for all. Please give him a very warm welcome this evening.
Thanks very much, Derek. Is this thing working? It always makes me feel like Madonna having something like this. I know I'm better looking than she is, but you know. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, half an hour, on the science that underpins failure. Failure in health, failure in education, failure in offending behavior, and so on. And then maybe have a 5-minute break to give you a chance to have a discussion with your neighbour so that you can come up with a few questions for me. And then after that 5 minutes, we'll move on and maybe have 20 minutes on what I think we should be doing about the science. And I emphasise the science bit because in 1989, I was a surgeon at the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow. And I was deeply upset by the health and lack of well-being in people in the East End of Glasgow. And it always struck me that it wasn't medicine that was going to cure them, because they would come in maybe with an alcohol-related illness, acute pancreatitis or whatever, for the third or fourth time. And I'd say to them, John, this is the fourth time you've been in here. If you keep on drinking, you're going to die. And the response was always the same. So what? Why should I care? Life's crap. Drink's the only thing that makes it worth living. And I thought, these people don't need more surgery. They need more well-being. And I set out on this journey to try and understand what well-being was and what gave us it. And this is what I've concluded. The circumstances in which we are born and grow up and live determines so much about the choices we make and the outcomes that we have in health, in terms of health. And we'll go through that, and I'll hope to convince you it's true. Now, this is what we are told about Scotland's health, that we are unhealthy, and it's because we smoke too much, eat the wrong kind of food, we drink too much, and if only we would get a grip of ourselves and do the right thing, we'd all be healthy. Is that a fair summary of what you read in the newspapers? Yeah, well, I want to tell you only one of those statements is true. And for those of you thinking about dropping into the pub on the way home, it's that one, okay? We are not basically an unhealthy nation. This slide shows life expectancy trends in 16 Western European countries going back 160 years. The thick line in the middle is Scottish life expectancy. You can see that for most of that time, Scotland has been absolutely in the middle of the pack. It's only in the past 5 or 6 decades that we've drifted towards the bottom of the league. Up until then, we were at the European average. And if you look at the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population, you can see that they've grown their life expectancy faster than the European average. And the rate of growth in life expectancy in the poorest 20% shows they've not done nearly so well. The gap between rich and poor since the 1950s has widened, and the average growth in life expectancy has slowed down. So if you're in the top 20% of incomes in Scotland, you do quite well in terms of life expectancy. The folk at the bottom are struggling. It's not due to cigarettes. This slide shows smoking rates in 15-year-old teenagers in the countries of the European region of the World Health Organization. Scottish teenagers, to the right of that slide, marked by the arrow, Scottish teenagers are the fifth lowest smokers in Europe. Scottish men in this study of European countries, the third lowest smokers, beaten only by Finland and Sweden. The ladies let us chaps down by being closer to the European average, but we're not where we are because we smoke so much. That doesn't explain it. But the smoking stuff is really quite interesting. This is a comparison of deaths from lung cancer among smokers in 4 long-term cohorts of people that have been studied. US veterans, volunteers working with the American Cancer Society, UK doctors, and at the top, people living in the west of Scotland. And what this shows is if you smoke 20 cigarettes a day and live in the west of Scotland, you are 4 times more likely to die of lung cancer than if you smoke 20 cigarettes a day and belong to one of the other groups. So the dose of tobacco you get is the same, but the impact it has on you is different. So there's something underlying our response to some of these threats that makes them more deadly to us. So what could it be? It's not diet, okay? Not primarily diet. This slide shows trends in heart disease death rates in men under the age of 75 in a number of European countries. And the yellow line you can see there is deaths in Finland. And you can see around about 1960s, the deaths of men in that age group in Finland were very high, just about the highest in the world. And the Finnish government took action to change the diet because everyone is telling them it's because we eat so much fat. So I once asked the director of the Finnish Institute of Public Health, how did you change the Finnish diet? And what he told me, this is verbatim, what he told me was, well, the Finnish Institute of Public Health told the Finnish government what to do, the Finnish government told the Finnish people what to do, and the Finnish people did it. To which I replied, well, that's Scotland stuff because we never do anything anyone tells us, okay? But what they did was they took subsidies away from dairy farmers to make it less profitable for them to produce fat, to produce milk, butter, cheese, cream. So they effectively took those out the Finnish diet, thereby making the Finns the most miserable people in Europe. And they gave them the subsidies back if they'd switched to growing fruit and vegetables. And they made free fruit and free salads compulsory in all schools and workplaces. And then you can see the falling death rates from heart disease in Finland. They said, aren't we clever? We've transformed the Finnish men's health. But alongside that yellow line in that graph, there is that sort of pale green line, and that's Scotland. The same pattern. While the Finns were taking fat out the diet, the Scots were inventing the deep-fried Mars bar. And it made no difference. The Scots saw the same percentage fall in death from heart disease as the Finns did. It was not the answer. In logic, it's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. You did something and then that happened, therefore you attribute the outcome to what you did. Other things were happening at the same time. The 1960s was the decade where men gave up smoking in enormous numbers. That's when the fall in smoking rates started, and that's probably the major contribution to those fall in heart disease deaths. But also new therapies were emerging, and every country saw that similar fall. So we jump to conclusions very often in our interpretation of health data. Now, what about the booze? Okay, so this slide shows death rates in our 16 Western European countries from alcoholic liver disease. The thin line at the top is the highest death rate any of our 16 Western European countries reached. The thin line along the bottom is the lowest death rate any of our countries reached, and the thick line in the middle is the average death rate in any of our 16 Western European countries. And from 1950 to 1970, Scotland had one of the lowest alcoholic liver death rates anywhere in Europe. This impression you've got of Scots as happy drunks is a myth, okay? Apart from anything else, we're never happy, but we were never drunks in the 50s or 60s. If you think about it, in the 50s and 60s, who drank? Well, men drank. What did they drink? Beer. Where did they drink it? In the pub. And when did they drink it? After work on a Friday night. From 1970 to 1990, it went up a bit because we were beginning to see liberalization of licensing laws. Pubs in the 60s and 70s shut on a Sunday. They closed in the afternoon and so on, but that gradually changed. And then from 1990, that happened. We went from the best to the worst in Western Europe for both men and women. And the culture had changed because now who drinks? Everyone drinks. What do they drink? Everything they can get their hands on. When do they drink it? All the time. And where do they drink it? Everywhere. The culture has changed entirely. And this marks this widening inequality between rich and poor that's emerged since the 50s and 60s. So what is actually behind this? We began to realize that it was more complicated. It wasn't just heart disease and cancer that was driving this widening gap. We had to look at in greater detail. And one of my colleagues at Glasgow University, Alistair Leyland, did a very clever thing. He split the population into 5-year age bands, and he plotted death rates according to socioeconomic status. So on that slide, on the left, you've got death rates in men aged 65 to 69 in the richest 20% of the population in the pale blue band, all the way down to the purple band on the right, which is the poorest 20% of the population. And you can see it's unequal. But what he did was a clever arithmetical thing. He converted all the information in that graph into a single number that measured the slope, the inequality slope. And he did that by subtracting the best from the worst and dividing by the average. Come up with a single number. So you do that across the whole population for each 5-year age group. You get those numbers and you can plot them on a graph that shows which age group is suffering the widest inequality. And it's young people. It's not folk in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, the ones who traditionally will die of heart disease and cancer. The inequalities shoots up round about late teens, it's at its highest in the early 30s, and starts to come down in the late 40s. Inequalities in deaths in Scotland are fundamentally a feature of young working age people. So what's causing these deaths? So Alistair went on and he started looking at individual causes of death. In the middle there is the slope index. He's calculating the slope index of inequality for heart disease. So you can plot the heart disease inequality on that graph, and you can see heart disease barely causes any problems in terms of inequality. It happens later in life than the big bulge, and it's relatively small. So what's causing that bulge? Well, it's drugs, alcohol, suicide, accidents, and violence. Scotland's widening inequality is due to death rates in young working age people due to essentially socioeconomically driven disorders. We're not drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence. We're not going to fix that by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. This is a fundamental malaise out in society. And people talked about the Glasgow effect as if the west of Scotland was somewhere different. I said, no, it isn't different. Basically, the pattern of inequality that we're seeing emerged in the 50s, 60s, at a time when steelworks were closing, shipyards were closing, railway locomotive works were closing, and so on. And all these jobs disappeared, and they were never adequately replaced. And the same things happen in places in England like Liverpool and Manchester. They got consumer electronics, they got car factories and so on. It never worked here. So my argument was Scotland got austerity 50 years before anyone else, and what we're seeing is that austerity. And just a couple of years ago, that view was confirmed by this data, which came from America. A Scot, actually working in Princeton University, published this slide which shows that white, non-African American, non-Hispanic men, blue-collar workers who'd never completed a college education or anything, between the year 2000 and 2014, saw a 240% increase in death rates from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And no other Western country saw that surge at that time. And he labeled those deaths of despair. And I think that's been the problem with Scotland. We've seen, an economy collapse in the latter half of the 20th century. Communities, the sort of new town policy and so on, people living in traditional communities in the centre of cities being picked up, put into new towns, losing their friends, not seeing them again. There was no Facebook, no mobile phones. I remember my closest friend at school, his father got a job down in Irvine, and I never saw him again from age 14. We tried to keep in touch, but it just wasn't possible. And so society broke up and jobs were lost. And in fact, what they then did in the States more recently was they plotted the counties that had the highest surge in deaths from drugs, alcohol, and suicide against those that voted for Donald Trump. And guess what? The people experiencing these deaths of despair turned to Trump as a kind of, well, I don't know, I can't understand it, but that's what's happening, the emergence of right-wing populist parties in Europe and so on, even in Britain. It's folk who are feeling despairing, try anything. So it's very significant in terms of its international consequences. So we're seeing this malaise emerging, and my interest was trying to work out what caused us to be well. Doctors believe that the thing that makes you well is not being ill, okay? Because doctors are trained in pathology, pathogenesis, the causes of disease. But yet, here were we finding and talking to patients the fact that they just couldn't be bothered. And there was that lack of desire to be well. So what causes it? And I came across this slide, which was produced by the Scandinavians, predictably. Salutogenesis is the opposite of pathogenesis. Salus was the Roman goddess of safety and well-being. So the term salutogenesis is a study of the causes of well-being. And there are 25 different theories on that slide, and I'll take you through them one at a time, will I? No, okay. If truth be told, I haven't actually read all of them. But I've read most of them. And you can summarize what they tell you by saying that people who are well, who tend to be well, who tend to be very successful in life, have an optimistic outlook. They have a sense of being in control of their own lives, and that is internal to them. They take the decisions about their lives, not other people. They have a sense of purpose. Life has meaning for them. I've got to stay fit and healthy because I want to see my grandchildren grow up. I've got to stay fit and healthy because I've got a really interesting job and I love what I do. They have purpose. They feel confident in their ability to deal with problems. They're not overwhelmed by problems. When something crops up, their response is, well, let's fix this, not just to sit down and ignore it. And critically, they are surrounded by a supportive network of people, and most of those studies have identified family members as the key person that is related to well-being in young people. So we began to look through this and see, well, what does it mean? And I remember reading one of those theories written by a book written by a guy called Aaron Antonovsky, who's an American sociologist who studied the health of adults whose children had been in concentration camps. And he said that in order to create well-being, individuals need to see the world round about them as understandable, manageable, and meaningful. Otherwise, they would experience a state of chronic stress. And I remember reading those last two words, chronic stress, and I remember sitting upright and I thought, eureka. This is the link between the social circumstances and the physical ill health. Because I was a surgeon, and a surgeon's job is to create acute stress in people. Seriously. The body's acute stress response is the body's defense mechanism. So when a surgeon operates on you, makes an incision, damages skin and so on, the body responds to that by releasing stress hormones, which flood your body with energy, mobilize glucose and so on. They kick into action processes of protein construction and so on that start the healing process. And what Antonovsky was saying was, if you are overwhelmed by the world round about you, not feeling in control, not understanding what's happening, you switch on this defense mechanism and it stays on chronically. And I began to think, maybe that explains what I'm seeing in the East End of Glasgow. So we started to look for evidence of chronic stress associated with socioeconomic status. This is Canadian data. It's stress hormone levels in babies in orphanages. The longer a baby is separated from a single significant adult, the higher its cortisol level is, cortisol being the key hormone that marks an elevated stress response. This is data from the civil service. A few years ago, Sir Michael Marmot went off and studied 30,000 civil servants, measured their stress levels, and cortisol levels are always highest in the morning and they come down and they're at lowest before they go to bed. So this is a daytime cortisol profile of higher grade and lower grade civil servants. The more senior you are in the civil service, the less stressed you are. Although maybe not this week, actually. The least stressed person in any government department is the permanent secretary. Why is that? It's because he's the boss. If a minister asks a permanent secretary to do something he doesn't fancy doing, it gets a director general to do it. And if he doesn't fancy it, it gets a director to do it. And if he doesn't fancy it, it gets a deputy director to do it. If he doesn't fancy doing it, it gets the lowest member of the organization, who's usually the chief medical officer, to do it. And he's permanently stressed all the time. Control. The lower your level of control, the more stressed you become. The optimism, the positive mindset, demonstrated very well by this study, carried out by an American woman called Susan Everson, who went to Finland to study these men at high risk of heart disease. She measured every risk factor you could think of, what they smoked, how obese they were, how much they drank, and so on. And one of the things she measured was hopelessness. She had a hopelessness questionnaire that allowed her to split men into three groups. The red bars are the men who are very, very hopeless. The sort of purple bars in the middle are the men who are moderately hopeless. And the paler bars on the left are the men who are just a little bit hopeless, because she was a woman and she knew that all men are hopeless to a greater or lesser degree. But what she was measuring was essentially positivity, positive view of the future. What she showed was that men who were very negative about the future were 4 times more likely to die of heart disease and 2.5 times more likely to die of cancer, even adjusting for their behaviors. She was able to adjust for how much they smoked and drank and so on, and take that out of the system. And adjusting for that, the hopelessness, the negativity was still associated with high risk of death. So what you're seeing are the psychological and hormonal drivers of a pattern of risk of early mortality. So how did this pattern of chronic stress emerge? And again, the next piece of the jigsaw I came across was when I saw this experiment which took place in the psychology department of a New York university. And the experiment they did was they made baby monkeys depressed. Oh, you can see that wee monkey there is not a happy monkey. He is withdrawn, not relating to mum or sibling. And the experiment they did was they changed the way mum was able to feed the babies. One half of the animal house, the food's lying out, mum's playing with the baby all the time. The baby indicates he's hungry. Mum reaches down, gets the food, feeds the baby, stress resolved. The other half of the animal house, they took the food away and hid it. So when baby indicated he was hungry, mum had to leave the baby. She was away from the baby for a long time. She had to fight with other mums to get access to food, so she was stressed. And if I were to ask you, which group of babies became depressed? Was it the babies where mum was there all the time, or mum was away for a lot of the time, and mum herself was stressed by the experience? You would naturally think it was that second group, wouldn't you? And usually when I ask that question, I can spot who the working mums are in the room. Well, actually, ladies, don't worry. It made no difference. The green triangles there are the stress hormone levels in the babies where mum found it easy to feed them. And the yellow triangles are the stress hormone levels in the babies where mum found it hard to feed them, and there is no difference. The red triangles, on the other hand, are the elevated stress hormones of the babies where they randomly changed the feeding pattern one day to the next. It wasn't mum being there or not being there, it was baby not knowing what was happening. He wasn't getting that pattern of the world being an understandable and predictable place. And if you think about what happens to a normal mother-baby relationship, baby cries, mum picks him up, cuddles him, talks to him, feeds him, stress resolved. And that's a kind of tennis match that goes on, a serve and return process. By the time that's happened 1,000 or 2,000 times, baby knows the world is structured. All I have to do is that crying thing. This mug comes along and fixes it. It's structured, it's predictable, and I'm in control. Contrast that to the experience of the baby who, when he cries, sometimes gets fed, but sometimes doesn't because mum's drunk or under the influence of drugs. And even worse, the boyfriend picks the baby up and shakes him and slaps him and so on, and baby learns the one thing he is programmed to do in order to attract support hurts. So he switches on survival mode. And the chronic stress is a result of that early experience. Next part of the jigsaw was when they started to look at the developing brains of these babies. And this interesting diversion, this is work done by a guy called Bruce McEwen, a very eminent American neuroscientist, who comes over here, and when he comes over here, I've got to help him trace his Scottish ancestors, because his last Scottish ancestor, born in Scotland, was deported at the end of the 17th century, having been on the losing side at the Battle of Boswell Brig. But Bruce is a fervent Scot. And what he discovered is that the developing brains of these babies changes in three ways. The prefrontal cortex is the bit of the brain that allows you to make smart decisions. It's the bit of the brain where you take in new information, you process it, and you act appropriately. That does not grow so well in stressed babies as it does in unstressed babies. The hippocampus is the bit of the brain that's important for memory. It allows you to take in new memories and store them. That does not grow so well, so these kids are less well able to learn at school. And the amygdala is the bit of the brain that lights up when you're emotionally aroused, and that becomes more active. So these children who experience these adverse events in early life are more anxious, aggressive, fearful, emotionally labile. They're less well able to learn at school, so they're labeled as being thick. And they don't make appropriate decisions about, if someone's annoying them, they'll lean forward and punch them, not realizing that's inappropriate. That's what's happening in kids who experience difficult lives. And we didn't just take the animal experiments as gospel. We went into the streets of Glasgow and we got volunteers to have their brain scanned. I was a bit nervous about this. Hey, mate, do you want your brain scanned? I needn't have worried because they were desperate. What, you mean you're going to tell me I've got a brain? Because these young people were told at school they were stupid. Can I get a certificate? One guy asked me. And we measured the volume of the hippocampus, the density of cells, and that's what's out on our streets. It's okay, mine will go off soon. We then measured the functioning of these centers of the brain. I'll just show you one. Choice reaction time is a measure of prefrontal cortex activity, processing new information. And what this shows, if you flash information up on a computer screen and ask people to press the button, the appropriate button in response to that new information, it shows that the most deprived people in our study took about 200 milliseconds longer to hit the right button than the least deprived people. Now, if 200 milliseconds doesn't sound very much, think of two cars driving at 50 miles an hour, side by side, one being driven by an affluent person, one being driven by someone with a difficult background, and a child walks out in front of them. The car being driven by the guy from the difficult background will take about 2 car lengths longer to stop. Not because he's not paying attention, he just simply processes the information more slowly. So you begin to see their accumulating disadvantage in all sorts of ways. The final bit of the jigsaw here for me was understanding how this whole process led to chronically elevated stress responses. This is the molecular biology of a cuddle, okay? This is what happens when you cuddle a baby, and it may be what happens when you cuddle me, but that depends who's doing the cuddling. When you comfort a baby, when you comfort anyone, it makes them feel happy, and happiness is associated with the production of a hormone called 5-hydroxytryptamine, or serotonin. The 5-HT circulates in the bloodstream. It's picked up by cells. There's a transport mechanism on the cell wall that transports it into the center of the cell. And there is a gene in one of the chromosomes, chromosome number 5, that when it comes into contact with the 5-HT, that gene becomes activated and it produces a protein that is essential for the control of the stress response. So babies who aren't nurtured never produce that protein, and their stress response is chronically elevated. So here we've got a scientific pathway that shows that the experience that children have in early life can lead to brains not working appropriately, social behavior being interfered with, learning being interfered with, and their biology being changed in a very fundamental way. A couple of big studies that have been carried out internationally have shown the long-term impact of that process. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, also known as the ACEs study, carried out in California, carried out in middle-class Californians. People here were members of the Kaiser Permanente health system, and that's a very middle-class system. What they did was they asked them about 9 different types of adverse event: physical, sexual, emotional abuse, physical, emotional neglect, parental absence through substance abuse, parental mental illness, parental incarceration. And what they found was that if you had 4 or more of those adverse events, for example, you were 8 times more likely to become an alcoholic than if you had none, about 12 times more likely to become a narcotics addict. Boys who experienced physical violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence themselves when they grew up, 4 or 5 times more likely to be arrested for carrying weapons. That's the pattern of excess deaths seen in the ACEs study. The blue bars are slight increases in deaths from heart disease and cancer. The red bars are increases in deaths from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence. And that's the pattern of excess deaths seen in Glasgow, for the same causes. So the hypothesis is that the social and environmental chaos and the economic chaos that emerged in the west of Scotland through loss of jobs, loss of traditional neighbourhoods and so on, has led to this pattern of increased risk. Similar studies carried out in the South Island of New Zealand, 1,000 children identified in the early 70s, subgroup of them identified as being living in chaotic circumstances. Those children living in chaotic circumstances and now in their 40s are more likely to be unemployed, more likely to have convictions for violence, more likely to have experienced teenage pregnancy, more likely to be substance misusers, and they're beginning to show signs of the chronic stress response with increased risk of diabetes, heart disease, and so on. So this is a reality. This is out there. And the question is, what do we do about it? What I think we're not doing well just now is we're looking at outcomes like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, chronic obstructive airways disease, cancers, and so on, and we're assuming that that's all due to behaviors. And we're saying you have to stop smoking, you have to, lose weight, etc., etc. We're lecturing people. We're telling people, oh, if you keep on doing that, you're going to die. Well, if you're not in control of your life, if you're depressed by the quality of your life and so on, a smart aleck like me coming along and telling you you're going to die just isn't helpful. But that's what we do. That's what our public policy is about. And it comes back to this ability to make choices, the ability to be in control. And that requires a sense of purpose and meaning and optimism and sense of self-esteem and friends. You need the well-being if you're going to make the right decisions and change your behaviors to reduce these risks. And at the moment, it just doesn't seem to me as if our policies, and it's not just Scotland I'm talking about here, I go all over the world. And the only place that comes even close to this are Scandinavian countries. He once asked me to go to the talk at the Nordic League in Iceland. It was quite interesting. The whole conference was in English, and I said to them, I'm really grateful that you're all speaking English because of me. And he said, no, it's not because of you. Nobody can understand a word the Finns say. So that put me in my place. So that's the biology. That's the sort of scientific underpinning of where we are in Scotland just now. And other countries are seeing the same thing. There are other countries are beginning to struggle with what they do about that. So if I give you a couple of minutes to think about it or talk to whoever you want, and you've got any questions on that, I'll take those questions before we move on to what I think we should be doing about it. Okay, want a couple of minutes? Go for it. Okay, folks, can we take 3 or 4 questions just now? And if you want, we've got a couple of roving mics if anyone wants to stick their hand up. And if you don't, I'll go on to part 2. Oh, there's one at the back, right up at the back.
Hello. Can you tell me, the hormone that's released by giving somebody a cuddle, is the hormone released by both male and female?
I don't know that there's any difference. You mean male or female babies?
Well,
or depending on who's doing the cuddling?
It's an article I read recently, and they said it just applied to females only, but this was adults, and I wasn't sure if it had.
I don't think that's. Who told you that?
It was an article I read just recently.
Right.
A ladies' article.
As far as I'm aware, the impact of serotonin is similar in both sexes. And there is an issue. So when you produce serotonin, there's an enzyme in the body that breaks it down, because if you just kept producing it, you'd be walking around with a really daft smile on your face. So there's a control mechanism. And someone a couple of years ago discovered a very active form of this enzyme, which they called the warrior gene, because that would lead to low serotonin levels, and in the males, that made the males very warlike, so they decided they would have to go and find a population that was warlike, and what they did was they went to the countries whose rugby teams did the haka. And they found in Samoa and the Pacific Islanders and in the Maori higher levels of monoamine oxidase type A. So there are different metabolic patterns associated with serotonin. But as far as if I'm being cuddled by a woman, I'm probably happier than if I'm being cuddled by a man. So there are probably some differences. Okay, any other questions? Here we go.
It sounds very much like, thank you. It sounds very much like earlier intervention is kind of a preventative. However, maybe a hypothetical question, but is there a tipping point? No.
It's interesting. If there is a tipping point, we haven't discovered it yet. I was overseeing Bruce McEwen a few months ago, and he's just completed a study in 35 to 55-year-olds, which he's shown that the brain changes associated with early years adversity are reversible in that age group. And the kind of things that he was trying were things like mindfulness, meditation, physical activity. Physical activity increases brain blood flow and sparks new brain cells to grow. But if you don't use them, you lose them after a few weeks. So the thing is to put them into action in various ways. And apparently someone has looked at Buddhists who meditate a lot, and their hippocampal volumes are significantly bigger than non-meditated. So there's a number of things you can do, but we're producing new brain cells throughout life. It used to be thought that brain plasticity was only up until about the age of 12 or 13, and it may fall off a bit, but it's still capable of reversal throughout life. Good news for some of us. Okay, well, I'll just go on, okay? So, the hypothesis, sorry, okay, yeah.
I'm not even sure if I can ask this question respectfully, so I'll try. I'm thinking about in the developing world, where people chronic poverty,
Yep.
food uncertainty. Are similar results found there?
The big studies, I'm not aware of these big studies being done. Yeah. They require quite sophisticated radiological techniques and so on. And in countries, low-income countries, I mean, a friend of mine told me that in terms of radiotherapy machines, there are only something like 10 radiotherapy machines in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
You know, this kind of thing.
So
the equipment is not actually there to allow these studies to be done in these countries. But again, we've got absolutely no reason to think that it's any different.
Yeah, I just wondered if people were doing work with refugees. I'm thinking about people coming from war zones and so on. Yeah.
No, I mean, I worry a lot about the refugee stuff. These poor children that are being dragged through Mexico just now and so on. Yeah. The fear must be horrible. Okay, so the hypothesis is that what we are in Scotland now is what we could term a cycle of alienation. We've got children living in chaotic households, their early years. They develop mental health problems, they get behavior problems, they can't concentrate, they get anxious and so on. When they go to school, they're much more likely to be excluded from school, a policy which I think is abhorrent. And I argue with teachers all the time. There's always a teacher that will stand up and say, oh, if they're disturbing the education of other kids, what else? We've got to exclude them from school. Well, you're the bloody teacher, mate. You find a better way of teaching them. Don't turn your back on them. And so therefore, they become excluded. They go down the back of the shopping centre. They get a bottle of vodka. They get into a fight. They go to jail. And I go to prison quite often. And usually they let me out. But when you're talking to an 18-year-old in Parliament or whatever, and okay, John, your sentence is coming to an end, what are you going to do when you get out? It's got that loss of self-esteem, loss of any sense of being in control of his life. And what he'll say is, I'll never get a job. I've got a criminal record. So what are you going to do? I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. And what he never says, because it's not part of his equation yet, is that the girlfriend will have a baby or two. And that baby's born into chaotic early years, and the cycle continues. And probably what we've seen since the 1950s has been that cycle repeating itself time and time again, making things worse and worse. So what are we going to do about it? Well, as Einstein said, if you carry on doing what you've always done, you'll get the same outcomes. And we have to do things differently. And what do we do in terms of public policy? Not just in this country, but every country. Well, we get experts to come and help ministers. So you get a group of experts, and I have been one of those experts. You get an expert to sit in a committee room and talk for a couple of hours, and a civil servant takes minutes. And you go away, and you come back again a month or two later, and the minutes are read out, and they talk a bit more, and more minutes are generated, and that process is repeated over several months. Then eventually a paper goes up to the minister who will approve it, and a civil servant is asked to write an implementation plan that goes out to the service, and nothing happens. And nothing happens because you can't expect frontline staff to be committed to a change they have had no say in shaping. You know, you go out to a health visitor working in the East End of Glasgow with some smart new policy and look at it and say, aye, right, you know, these smart Alex need to come down where I am, and, you know, that kind of thing. We need to involve not just frontline public sector staff, but people themselves in shaping the change. Frontline staff, including teachers, social workers, health visitors, nurses, GPs, the people interacting with the problem, not ruling anyone out, okay? What is important, and this is an observation from lots of successful projects that I have seen, is that there is a process between the person who's trying to help and the person who is receiving, or the person who is engaging with that helper. And the process begins with trust. It begins with a dialogue which says, okay, what matters to you? What is it that you need in order to live a better life? Because if it matters to you, it matters to me, and I will work with you to achieve that. That builds trust. The individual begins to realize, well, I've got a lot of respect for this person, and they're respecting me, therefore I must be worth something. That builds up their sense of self-esteem. They begin to think, okay, maybe I can choose alternative lifestyles. And then he's supported while they begin to move into a different area. And at first, the penny dropped with me after I was giving a talk, and this guy came up to me afterwards and he said, I've heard you talk before, you'd be interested in this. And he handed me a brown paper parcel. And in it was the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. This is the model Alcoholics Anonymous use. I've been where you are. I know what you're going through. I'm here to help you. Phone me any hour of the day or night if you're in trouble, and we'll see you through this. And I've seen it happen in all sorts of models. I've seen it happen where people with post-traumatic stress syndrome get the opportunity to learn carpentry. I've seen it in theatre, I've seen it in music, I've seen it. It's that whole thing. People coming together to support each other. Some examples of how simple it is. The Broadway experiment was carried out in the City of London, where they had trouble with 13 really hardcore rough sleepers. These guys had been sleeping rough for between 4 years and 45 years. And the 45 years is a real achievement, because 45 is about the life expectancy of a rough sleeper. And they were costing the city council a shed load of money. They had reckoned they would spend on these 13 people more than £1 million in the previous years. They were attending A&E departments, they were being arrested, they were getting all sorts of support in all sorts of different ways. And they said, step back and think about this differently. They set up bank accounts for all 13 of them, put £3,000 in each bank account. They got a social worker to act as a mentor for them, and that social worker worked on the basis of what matters to you. And against all the predictions, which was, they'll just spend all the money on drink and drugs, what they asked for, one guy asked for a new pair of spectacles because he could pick up the metro and read it, and he couldn't because his specs were broken. One guy asked for a new hearing aid. The most expensive thing anyone asked for was a guy who said the only time in his life he'd ever been happy was as a boy when his family used to go on holiday to a caravan site in Kent. Could they go and see if there was a disused caravan that he might buy with the money, and he would go and live in it? At the end of a year, 11 of the 13 were in permanent accommodation. 2 of them had jobs. They'd used some of the money to get a bit of training. The average spend of the £3,000 bank accounts was £780. What had happened was they'd built up a sense of self-esteem through trusting relationships, and these guys had taken control of their lives. The Economist, that well-known left-wing newspaper, concluded that the most efficient way to spend money on the homeless might be to give it to them. Yeah, trust people, and they respond. Minimum income, citizens' basic income. Richard Nixon, again that crazy left-winger, was on the verge of signing into action a bill to give every American a basic citizen's income. And that was on the basis of studies carried out in America in the 70s. In the places that it was tried, in Canada, what they saw was reduced domestic violence, better mental health, significant reduction in hospitalizations in the people who got the income. High school graduations in one part of New Jersey went up by 30%. However, the whole thing was torpedoed because in the city of Seattle, divorces increased by 50%, so they said. And the right-wing response to this was, well, this is what happens if you make women financially independent. They walk away from their husbands. In fact, it was fake news. The bill was torpedoed. 10 years later, someone went back and examined the data, and there wasn't a scrap of evidence to say that it had happened. It was invented by people who wanted to torpedo it. Evelyn Forget, who was in Glasgow 6 or 7 weeks ago talking about it, said that this was torpedoed because the political right is afraid people will stop working and the left doesn't trust them to make their own choices. A lot of truth in that. In fact, this question of if you give people basic income, they'll stop working, women reduced their working hours by about 8 or 9% because they were doing more childcare. It allowed them to be with their children more. Good thing. Men reduced their working hours by 2 or 3% because they're away taking extra courses to expand their job opportunities. What's not to like? The Wheatley Group, Scotland's biggest housing association, 75,000 socially rented homes. Every member of staff in the Wheatley Group is trained in this process of Think Yes. And Think Yes, they teach their staff that if a member of the public comes to see them with a problem, they take responsibility for the problem solving. They don't say, well, if you go down the corridor, there's an office down there, or here's a phone number you can call, or fill out this form and I'll be in touch with you. It's right. What do you need? What will make a difference to you? That individual member of staff, whether it's one of the directors or it's a receptionist on the front desk, fixes it. And it all came about because Martin Armstrong, the chief executive of the Wheatley Group, was asked by a counsellor to go and see a woman who was suicidal. This woman is a complete basket case. She's going to be evicted. She doesn't know where to turn, and she tells me she's thinking about committing suicide. Martin says he was in her house for 5 minutes when he sussed out the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem was the fact that she had 2 children who were both autistic, and they couldn't be let out the house because they would wander away and get lost. They were under her feet 24/7, and the stress was crucifying her. And the reason they would wander away and get lost was because there was no fence around the garden. So Martin got hold of the housing officer and said, what about this fence? Oh, I know about the fence, but I can't build it until I get a health and safety assessment. I said, build the fence. Do the right thing. This woman needs it. Do it. Other rules say, stuff the rules. I'm the boss. Build the bloody fence. Fence built, problem solved. The woman took control. And she realized, if I have a problem, there's somebody sensible I can interact with. As a result of this, Martin set up the Wheatley Foundation, which spends literally £3 or £4 million a year supporting young people from Wheatley homes with bursaries to go to college or whatever. That kind of thing makes a huge difference. Beacon and Old Hill Estate, really interesting place. City of Falmouth, all the employment in Falmouth was in the Naval Dockyard, which closed. Crime spiraled. The police admitted that during this period in the 70s and 80s, they turned their back on Beacon and Old Hill. It was just too violent. 2 health visitors were so disgusted by a particular incident that involved a wee girl's pet rabbits being thrown on a bonfire. They said, right, enough is enough. We're going to have to fix this. They leafleted 50 houses. They worked out 50 people in this community of about 3,000 or 4,000 who might help them. 5 people turned up to the meeting. Those 5 people and the 2 health visitors transformed this by beginning to make a difference. They started off by beginning to cut down all the overgrown gardens. In fact, one of the health visitors told me that when they did the first street, the gardens were so overgrown, they got money to have, hatchets and all this kind of stuff. One garden was so overgrown that as they cut it away, they found a long-forgotten, disused Ford Transit van in the garden. And they started to make a difference, and people began to feel, yeah, we can make a difference, we can take control. And this is what these 2 health visitors created. Crime down by 50%. They got a public apology from the chief constable, who admitted they'd turned their back on the community. Huge reductions in unemployment, child protection registrations down by 2/3. Teenage pregnancies almost disappeared because people began to take control. And it was people supporting other people. It wasn't a strategic plan coming from the ministry that did this. It was just 2 health visitors turning on folks' sense of control. And when you look at social connectedness, when you look at the friendship, when you look at people attending church, people being part of a club, people having a large circle of friends, 148 studies in the literature covering 300,000 people, where you have a high level of social integration, the people who are socially integrated have a 50% reduction in risk of death during the course of these studies. Where it's a complex pattern of social interaction, where it's actually folk physically helping each other out, 90% increase in survival. There is something magical about affection, support, care, compassion. It works. It does things to our biology. And Glasgow, we measured this in a number of UK cities. Glasgow has the lowest level of social connectedness of any of the cities we measured. And I was talking about this in Govan one night, and this guy came up to me after and said, you're absolutely right. He says, I've just moved in here. And I was in my house 2 days, and I came downstairs, and the back window had been tanned and had been burgled. And I went to my neighbour, and I hadn't met him yet, and I knocked on his door, and I said, hello, I'm your new neighbour. I've just been burgled. To which the response was, well, it wasn't me. Not quite the right response that you would hope for, but a number of other places have measured the same thing, and Glasgow's always at the bottom, and it prides itself about being a friendly city and so on. The evidence is that people are very suspicious. If we're talking about children growing up, being engaged, being optimistic, being educated and creative and so on, we are creating huge problems for ourselves in the way we're treating lots of children just now. Imagine living in a situation like that where you don't know what's going to happen. Imagine living in cities that are liable to be bombed or whatever. We are causing serious problems for the future by not caring for each other. And what I'm pushing for, and this might not be quite big enough for you to read, but what I'm pushing for is a transformation in attitudes to public services. At the moment, on the left-hand side of that slide, we have a very rational system which identifies problems and responds to a crisis. The surest way to get any action from a minister is to provoke a crisis. Once it's in the newspapers, ministers will leap into action. I know instruction will go out if it was find a solution to this. And a civil servant who doesn't really quite understand what the problem is will usually come up with some kind of solution, which will be the wrong solution. And it will be a solution that does things to people rather than working with them to make a difference. But at the bottom of the public sector way of working just now is play it safe. Don't use money inefficiently. Don't get the organisation into any disrepute. Don't take any risks. And this all comes from the time that Mrs. Thatcher asked the chief executive of Sainsbury's to come and review the management of the health service. And he introduced all these management disciplines and so on. And Tony Blair then took them on even further. We're working to the wrong paradigm in terms of managing our society. The right-hand side, however, is instead of telling people what to do, ask them what they think they need. What matters to you? Look for their strengths and build on their strengths. Build networks. Help the citizen begin to say, okay, if I've got a problem here, I've got someone I can go to, and they pull for help rather than have help pushed down their throat. Building strong communities, strong citizens is the way to transform this because it will change your biology and you won't have all these issues. At the moment, our public sector behaviour is to the left of that, this new public management, which is all about targets and indicators and sanctions and inspections and so on. We've moved into the middle of that with quality improvement. Since I was Chief Medical Officer when we introduced the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, where we deliberately told ministers to butt out. We'll get people together from the health service, we'll work with them to do lots of different things to reduce the risk of infection, falls, cardiac arrest, all that kind of stuff. I see a story in the paper that since over the past 10 years, the Patient Safety Programme, they reckon, has saved 10,000 lives in Scottish hospitals. Significant reductions in death rates from a whole load of avoidable problems. We then implemented that in an early years programme, 15% reduction in infant mortality in Scotland, because the frontline staff tried things and implemented the things that worked. We didn't tell them what to do. They told us what worked and what didn't work. What we need to do is move into the right-hand curve on this, where we co-produce solutions with people. We mobilize social action in ways that allow people to be supported who are struggling at the moment. And I'll finish with a few quotes. Jimmy Reid. Most folk will know who Jimmy Reid is. Anyone here not know who Jimmy Reid was? Okay, a few folk admitting to it at the back. Jimmy Reid was a communist shop steward in Upper Clyde Shipbuilders. In 1970, Edward Heath's government wanted to shut down shipbuilding in the Clyde, and Jimmy Reid was a very clever man who did not take the workers out on strike to protest. He took them into work. And the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders work-in became a cause célèbre on the news every night. And Jimmy was a fabulous orator, and every night the BBC were there with the cameras listening to his latest pronouncements, and eventually the Conservative government backed down and gave them the money they needed to compete with shipyards elsewhere. Now, I was a medical student in 1971 when we elected Jimmy Reid Lord Rector of Glasgow University. His rectorial address was reprinted in full in the New York Times, which called it the single most important public speech since the Gettysburg Address. And those of us who were there thought that comparison of Jimmy Reed with Abraham Lincoln was immensely flattering to Abraham Lincoln. It was about alienation, which he defined as the cry of men who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control, the frustration of ordinary people excluded from the processes of decision-making, the feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel with justification they have no say in shaping or determining their own destinies. He nailed it. He understood what was happening in West Central Scotland at that time. Now, I have to say, the day before the independence referendum, the National Theatre of Scotland arranged an event up on the Mound in Edinburgh where they had people like Ricky Ross from Deacon Blue and Elaine C. Smith and all that kind of stuff in doing readings and singing. And they asked me to go and recite Jimmy Reed's rectorial address. And I could hardly get through it for greeting. It was, it is just so magical. He nailed it. He understood what was happening. And if you look at religion through the centuries, every single major philosophical, religious grouping has compassion at its heart. Buddha, compassion is that which makes the heart of the good move at the pain of others. It crushes and destroys the pain of others. It is called compassion because it shelters and embraces the distressed. Pretty good. Confucius, a Confucian king in the 9th century, came up with this. We indicate to rulers that rather than punish the country's deviants, consider the poverty of the multitudes and relieve their misery, and then criminals will disappear. The reason why ordinary people act badly comes from widespread inability to survive day to day. There is no source of criminality in the country but waste of natural resources. Interesting point. This is the reason why ignorant underclasses are not honest. It is because their rulers who should be honest are not. Oh boy. It's interesting, my wife and I were on a cruise recently and we stopped in Sicily and we did the Godfather tour. And we asked the driver, okay, Antonio, are we allowed to mention the mafia here? And he says, oh, you will not meet any mafioso in these villages. He said, they're all up in Palermo in the government. I thought, yep, times haven't changed. Joseph Townsend, on the other hand, was a Church of England cleric. He was also a medical doctor, and I think if he was alive today, he'd be working for the Department of Work and Pensions. Hunger will tame the fiercest animal. It is only hunger which can spur and goad the poor on to labour. Ooh, nasty. And I may say, as a medical graduate of Glasgow University, I am delighted to tell you he was a medical graduate of Edinburgh University. Adam Smith, who's often thought of as being the architect of markets, which are bad things and so on. Adam Smith wrote 2 books, and the more important book was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he said this: no matter how selfish we may suppose man to be, there are some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, even although he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. He was a good psychologist. This guy, the guy in the black suit there on the right-hand side, is a Catholic priest who 30 years ago was sent to the most violent parish in California, south central Los Angeles, where the Latino gangs just ran riot. And he says he was in the parish for half an hour. He'd put his bag in the house and he's sort of wandering down the street. A police car stopped him and he said, Father, if you carry on going down this road any further, you'll be dead in 10 minutes. The Latino gangs will not brook any authority figure. 30 years on, he came to Glasgow at the invitation of the Violence Reduction Unit. He transformed lives of about 3,000 or 4,000 of these guys by building a bakery. Well, actually, the other guy in the suit there was a film producer friend of his who gave him money to buy a disused building, and he created homeboy bakeries. And he told me that he'd been in there about a week and he had to start a second company called Homeboy Tattoo Removal because they all had gang tattoos, which caused trouble. But he said one guy in particular came in, and you'll have to pardon my language here, but I'm merely repeating what the priest said to me, okay? He said, this guy came in and he sat down in front of my desk and he said, Greg, you have to help me. I'm desperate to get a job, but I keep going to have interviews and they won't entertain me. They won't even listen to me. And he said, I looked at him, and as well as the piercings, his ears, his lips, his nose, his eyebrows, and so on, the tattoos were really quite striking. He said, particularly one, he had tattooed in 2-inch high letters across his forehead, fuck the world. Greg said, I think I might know what your problem is. So he got a plastic surgeon friend of his to come and remove that tattoo and problem solve. But that kind of thing, he got to know the people. He just went and chatted to them, and he told me another story, which was there was this, he would go up to a group of them, you know, they're there with machetes and guns and fearsome and so on. He'd just go and chat to them, how are you doing today? He said there was this wee guy, any time he approached, he would run away. And eventually he said, what's that wee guy's name? Paul, okay. So the next time he went up, Paul turned to run away, and the other guys put their arm around Paul and kept him there, and they chatted. As he turned to go, Greg said, right, see you, Paul. And he turned away and he heard Paul whisper, the priest knows my name. And he said the penny dropped. This wee guy had constantly been called you, he'd been called nicknames, he'd been called this. No one ever recognized him as a human being, as an individual, and so on. And he began to build that friendship. And when he came to Glasgow, I took him around various schools, and he told the kids something that stuck with me, which is, what we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than one that stands in judgment at the way we carry them. If we were in that position, would we behave any differently? Probably not. Just finally, Terry Waite, be known to all of you, spent 5 years incarcerated in Lebanon, having gone at the behest of the Archbishop of Canterbury to try and mediate in the civil war that they were having. I had dinner with him once. I laughed for 2 hours. A man without a single shred of rancor or regret or anything about the way he was treated. And I'll just tell you one story he told me. So he wasn't allowed to see the faces of his jailers. Any time one of the jailers came, he had to put a blindfold on and all that kind of stuff. And one time he said, look, I'm an educated man, and I've been in here for 6 months, and I haven't had anything to read, and it's driving me crazy. Please bring a book for me. The guy said, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to do it. Please, 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 please. Eventually the guy said, yeah, okay, I've got a book. I'll bring it the next time. So Terry got very excited and heard the guy coming, put the blindfold on, heard the book going down on the table, heard the door closing, excitedly took the blindfold off, and he picked up the book to find that it was The Theory and Practice of Breastfeeding. So what he did was he drew a penguin, and he said, buy me a book with this little bird on it. And thereafter he got his books. But again, at the end of it, I said to him, okay, what's the solution to the Middle East? What is going to make a difference? And that's what he said. At the end of the day, love and compassion will win. So I'll inhabit a world where people judge individuals, consider them as wasters, consider them as, oh, they're just addicts, just this, they're trash, all that kind of thing. Actually, what they're suffering from is a shortage of love and compassion. And it's up to us to show them that. That's what we need to do. We need to be brave, we need to be courageous, we need to go out there, we need to give the hugs. And again, I was giving a talk to a group of people being helped by the Violence Reduction Unit, and this wee guy at the back, when that slide went up, he said, excuse me, is that a real lion? No. What I tell folk is be courageous. Get your feet wet, even get them muddy. Get out there. Try something new. Do something different to support someone in difficulty. And if it works, tell everyone about it and get them to do it as well. And if it doesn't work, tell everyone about it so they don't waste their time. There's no shame in failure except not telling people you've failed, because then they don't learn. But we come together as a society, we try things and we spread the learning. But the heart, the thing that will transform all those biochemical abnormalities that we've characterized so clearly, is showing people that you care for them. At that point, I will stop. Thanks very much. So, does anyone have any quick questions? I'm away at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, so I want to get to my bed at a reasonable time, so I'll take a couple of questions. If anyone's got... Yeah.
Significant space and time when perhaps people started not to care?
That's an interesting question, and I wasn't around, 30,000 years ago. I think there are inbuilt instincts about caring for individuals in one's family and all that kind of thing. But as society becomes more complex and becomes more competitive, and the competition that exists today is all about the 1% accruing ever more wealth, and, the thing that is causing problems just now is slow income growth amongst the rest, and feeling, that society is leaving them behind. I think it's pretty clear that the uber rich do not care. All they care about is money, and, I look at what's happening around Brexit and so on, and you look at the folk who are shouting most about Brexit, they must have worked out a way to profit from this. I may be all very cynical, but that's how they've been behaving for the last 20, 30 years. So whenever big decisions are being made around politics, around taxation and so on, somebody's going to score a lot of money off it. And I just think that, I've never been a member of any political party. My friend Sam Galbraith wanted me to join the Labour Party and stand for Parliament and so on. I said, Sam, I'd rather have my eyes plucked out. I'm a scientist. I want to understand the science of this, but the science of this tells me that caring for people... When I go to the Health and Sport Committee in the Parliament, I talk about this, and the folk on the left see this as an issue of social justice. And I say to the folk on the right, if you look after families, if you support families, their kids will do well at school, they won't go to jail, they won't become drug addicts, they'll get jobs, they'll become creative, they'll pay taxes. And you can see the penny dropping. I've actually had a Conservative MSP say to me, I think you might be right here. Oh, shit. So I'm not driven by any kind of political thing. I'm driven by the science of it. And the science tells me there will always be some people who want to profit at the expense of others, but there are more of us than there are of them.
It's not so much a question as a comment. I was resonating when you were saying people that are born into poverty and disruptive homes and all of that and chaos, and then not being appreciated or having a sense of wellness when they're young, either through school or with community. And I worked in the women's prison for 3 years, and the majority of women in the prison should not be in the prison, primarily just because of that cycle that you were talking about, because then they go to drugs and the alcohol to block out what happened to them, and they don't have a sense of wellness or well-being, and they go back into society and the whole thing
It starts again.
Just
Prison
starts
is not
again.
the answer for
No,
most
it's not the
people.
answer.
I was given a talk to English chief constables, and the chief constable of one county came up to me afterwards and told me that he was doing a randomized controlled trial of criminal justice. So if you're arrested in his county, you go through a triage system. So if you've done something really horrible, there is no discussion, you're charged and you go through the courts. But medium and low-risk offenders are randomly allocated to the conventional approach of being charged and going to the courts, or not being charged and being given a support package. And what he told me was, a couple of years into the study, 65% of those that had been through the courts have reoffended. 8% of the others had reoffended. You know, so all of this stuff is out there, but there's a narrow-minded doctrinaire approach which says, oh, they've done bad things, they have to be punished. Well, why have they done bad things? And how can we stop them not doing bad things in the future? By locking them up? Not a scrap of evidence that that happens. So, and indeed, I came across another randomized control trial, this what matters to you approach. In America, I met a guy who is doing a randomized controlled trial of this, and what he was using was, to measure the effectiveness of it, he was using a thing called number needed to treat. So when you test a drug, say you want to give people aspirin to stop them having heart attacks or strokes, the number of people you need to treat with aspirin to prevent one heart attack or a stroke is 1,600. In this case, he said the number of people you need to use this what matters to you approach in order to prevent one adverse event like a suicide attempt or an arrest is 10. So there's all this evidence out there. Let's take control and make it happen. Because if we're waiting for the high hegians to do this, they're petrified of the newspapers. The Daily Mail will stand up and say they've all gone all soft on crime and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'd be quite proud to be soft on crime in those circumstances. Right, one last one, okay?
First of all, thanks very much for a very enlightening speech, and the information's tremendous. My worry is that we will still see it as somebody else's problem. It will be the up-theres that will blame. And here we are in the middle of Motherwell, and I think a lot of people who are here will probably be here because they've got a church connection. What are we going to do about this here?
Right.
That, I suppose, is what I'm asking. What are we going to do about this? You're saying take control. Yeah. You're saying it's to do with one-to-one or a group being involved. What do we do about it?
So I would bet that within this church at the moment, there are people who are involved in lots of different organizations, who are doing lots of things with different people and so on. And the way we would deal with this would be to do something very similar to what we did with the patient safety program, which is people come together and show evidence. Like we dealt with, like today at the Wheatley Foundation board meeting, we were looking at evidence of drug addicts who are members of, who are tenants, and how they've been supported. And, we had numbers. The number of people who are being supported, the number of people who have changed the things, the number of people who are in rent arrears and all that kind of thing. So what the theme around improvement is, what do you want to change, by how much, by when, and by what method? So you sit down and you say, okay, what's the problem in Motherwell just now? Is it drugs? Is it alcohol or whatever? We're going to change this by such and such, by when, and we'll try things. We'll try different methods, and we'll meet together every few months and see how it's happened, what the changes have happened. And we've done that, and it's produced 10,000 fewer deaths in hospitals, 15% reduction in infant mortality. And in next month, I've got a meeting with Lanarkshire Health Board about beginning to do some of this stuff with their staff. And it might well be that we can create an improvement collaborative within Motherwell around some of the social things, but you have to come together and agree, what do we want to change, by how much, by when, and then we can start to talk about the method. But it's just doing things. The way we started the patient safety program, so when you're being ventilated in an intensive care unit, you've got a tube down your throat and air's being blown in, you're paralyzed and it's breathing for you. When I worked in intensive care units, if you were being ventilated for a week, you got pneumonia because that air was unsterilized and it was blowing in. And we went to the intensive care folk and we said, well, there are certain things you can do that will reduce the risk of pneumonia. And they said, oh, we do all of that. I said, really? Where's the data that shows you do it? Oh, we don't need the data. Try collecting the data. They came back to us a month later and said, we thought we did it, but when we collected the data, we don't. And I've got graphs that show that as they complied with the suite of things that you need to do for these patients, the incidence of infection disappeared. So if 90% of patients were getting ventilator-acquired pneumonia in the 1980s, there are whole hospitals in Scotland that have not had a single ventilator-acquired pneumonia in the past 2 years because of that approach. So it's about coming together, learning what works, and sharing the information and doing it and collecting the information that shows you do it. If you go into some hospitals, you'll see charts on the wall that say, hand washing or falls prevention and all this kind of thing. It's the same as if you go into an engineering factory, the number of days since the last incident. Knowing that information drives you along. It makes it different. I was in Australia recently talking to GPs about doing this, and this guy put his hand up and said, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that until we had an electronic information system to collect all the data. So I showed him a slide of Bedtime Bear. When we did the Early Years Collaborative, one of the things they wanted to do was enhance reading and cognitive ability in kids. And bedtime stories are one of the things that they come up with as something they wanted to do. So one nursery in East Ayrshire said, we'll give all the kids in our nurseries a teddy bear and tell them that Bedtime Bear needs a story before he'll go to sleep at night. So we'll get the kids to take Bedtime Bear to Mummy and Daddy and get Mummy and Daddy to read Bedtime Bear a story. So the child gets the story. So what they tweeted was a sheet of A4 paper with a felt tip pen. Week 1, 55% of kids got it. Cross Bedtime Bear. Week 2, 65% got a story. That was the high-tech information system that led to about 90% of children in these nurseries getting stories. So you can do it. You just have to have the will. And the will, I think, what should drive that will is compassion and love for your fellow man and woman. But watch who you cuddle. Thanks very much.
Thank you for these questions. This evening, Harry Burns has helped us all to understand a bit more about what makes for human flourishing and what gets in the way of it and what enables it. And in a sense, I suppose the word compassion is one which has resounded loud in the church here tonight, something which we should all be aware of and all able to convey and to live out. We're greatly indebted to Harry Burns as our guide and our inspirational teacher this evening. I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's been a privilege for all of us to be here in this church this evening. And so please show your appreciation once more to Professor Sir Harry Burns.